Judge mocks an elderly black woman in court, shocked to know she's a legendary attorney. In a bustling downtown courtroom of the Los Angeles Superior Court, an elderly black woman steps through the mahogany double doors. Her shoulders are stooped and her hands tremble slightly on a battered leather briefcase. Onlookers exchange puzzled glances, wondering what business this frail figure has among the city's toughest litigators. Then the presiding judge smirks with thinly veiled contempt, dismissing her as if she were lost. Little does he know she is no stranger to these halls. This is the astonishing story of how prejudice meets its match in a woman whose hidden legacy defies every assumption, reshaping the pillars of justice forever. The morning sun filtered through high windows as the bailiff rattled off a list of cases for the day. Judges, attorneys, and clerks rushed through the courthouse corridors, weaving through a sea of file-laden carts and hurried whispers. Inside courtroom 12A, an imposing judge named Robert Albright took his seat behind the elevated bench, black robes falling in severe lines across his broad shoulders. Known for his no-nonsense approach and biting sarcasm, Judge Albright prided himself on running a tight ship. People with scheduled hearings filled the rows. Some craned their necks for a glimpse of the day's high-profile cases, a corporate lawsuit pitting a small group of tenants against an influential real estate giant. The case had garnered local media attention due to allegations of discrimination and illegal evictions. Rumors circulated that the defense team had mustered big-name lawyers to trample the tenants' rights. Then, just before the proceedings began, an elderly black woman shuffled in, wearing a slightly wrinkled navy blue suit. Her grey hair was neatly braided and pinned into a small bun at the nape of her neck. She clutched a single, well-worn leather briefcase. Court staff spared her a passing glance, but quickly returned to their tasks, assuming she might be a family member or an onlooker. The bailiff signaled for quiet as Judge Albright cleared his throat and reviewed the day's docket. Case number 22, CV 1098, Martinez et al. There versus Westbridge Development Corporation, the clerk announced. Representatives for Westbridge Development stood promptly two polished attorneys from a prestigious firm. On the plaintiff's side, a visibly nervous younger lawyer in a modest suit positioned himself at the plaintiff's table. In the back row, the elderly woman quietly observed, hands folded atop her briefcase. Judge Albright peered over his glasses, zeroing in on the woman as though she were an anomaly in his carefully orchestrated courtroom. Something about her presence, her calm confidence, made him uneasy, yet he dismissed the feeling. To him, she appeared frail and out of place, a relic from another time. Unbeknownst to the judge, this was the day that his preconceived notions would be shattered irreparably. The court clerk nodded to the younger plaintiff's attorney. "Are you ready to present your motion?" he asked. The young lawyer, Brian Moore, stepped forward. He seemed uncertain, adjusting his tie as if it were strangling him. He began to speak in a quavering voice about the questionable eviction notices Westbridge Development had sent to tenants in a historically black neighborhood, a neighborhood rumored to be ripe for gentrification. Before Brian could delve into the details, the doors at the rear of the courtroom creaked open. The elderly black woman rose from her seat and walked forward, placing herself next to Brian. A collective murmur swept the gallery. Judge Albright's eyes narrowed in mild irritation. "Ma'am," the judge said pointedly, "are you lost? This is a civil hearing, not open mic night." A faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips. She introduced herself simply as Clara Hastings. She explained, in a gentle tone, that she was there to assist the plaintiffs. Brian Moore glanced at her with gratitude, but confusion shadowed his eyes. They had spoken only briefly outside the courtroom when Clara offered him a helping hand. He hadn't known her background, only that she seemed profoundly knowledgeable about this case. Judge Albright tapped his pen against a stack of papers. Assist them? In what capacity exactly? His question dripped with condescension. Clara's voice was as steady as granite. I have the authority to appear in this matter, Your Honor. I'll be co-counsel for the plaintiffs. A ripple of surprise passed through the audience. Even Westbridge's polished lawyers exchanged puzzled glances. Judge Albright rubbed his temples. I've never heard of you, Miss Hastings. Are you sure you're at the right hearing? Most attorneys who come before me have at least a cursory reputation. How old are you, if you don't mind my asking? Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. Old enough to remember when we fought for fair housing rights in this city decades ago, Your Honor. And old enough to have earned my seat at any counsel's table. Judge Albright let out a dry laugh. We'll see if you've earned it, he muttered, motioning for Brian Moore to continue his argument. Little did the judge suspect that he had just thrown down a gauntlet to one of the most formidable legal minds of her generation. The next day, Clara arrived at the courthouse early. She navigated the familiar corridors with unhurried steps, greeting security officers and court staff by name. The more seasoned employees recognized her from decades past. Whispers trailed in her wake. Is that really Miss Hastings? I thought she had retired. She's a legend. In the small conference room adjacent to courtroom 12A, Clara reviewed case files with Brian Moore. Stacks of documents teetered precariously on the table. Brian marveled at how deftly Clara arranged them, summarizing each legal argument with crisp clarity. She pointed out precedents from Shelley versus Kramer, a real landmark Supreme Court case that deemed racially restrictive covenants unenforceable, and other civil rights-era rulings that could bolster the tenant's claims. Brian listened, scribbling notes frantically. Between depositions and procedural motions, Clara found a moment to catch her breath. She gazed out the window at the swirl of city life below, reflecting on a time when she had marched in protest lines, risking arrest to demand equal rights. In her younger years, she had worked alongside iconic attorneys who fought cases that shaped history. Now, ironically, she faced a modern form of discrimination, packaged as corporate expansion. Brian approached with an uneasy expression. Miss Hastings, I've been reading about your background in the National Bar Association archives. You led a landmark housing discrimination lawsuit in 1978, didn't you? His voice brimmed with awe. No one told me you'd be joining this case. It's an honor. Clara offered him a gentle smile. I left the spotlight a long time ago, but certain issues call me back. Housing rights, especially for people of color and elderly residents, that's my life's work. When I heard about Westbridge Development evicting seniors under questionable pretenses, I couldn't stand by. Brian nodded, feeling a surge of confidence. Well, I'm certainly glad you're on our side. Across the hallway, Judge Albright stepped out of his chambers. He glanced through the conference room window, noticing Clara and Brian deep in conversation. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. He still dismissed the elderly woman as irrelevant, his prejudice blinding him to the fire that burned behind her warm, unassuming demeanor. When proceedings resumed that afternoon, the tension in courtroom 12A was palpable. Journalists, alerted by rumors of a mystery woman attorney, gathered in the back rows. Westbridge's legal team, led by a silver-haired partner named Meredith Langford, presented a motion to dismiss the tenant's lawsuit, claiming lack of sufficient evidence. They argued that the evictions were purely business decisions, unrelated to race or age. Judge Albright leaned forward, lacing his fingers. Let's hear from the plaintiff's side, Mr. Moore. Brian rose, only to step aside and allow Clara Hastings to take the podium. She walked with deliberate grace, ignoring the skeptical gaze. The judge shot her way. Your Honor, Clara began in a calm, measured tone. The plaintiffs contend that Westbridge Development's actions are not mere business decisions, but a strategic attempt to displace low-income Black and elderly residents. We have documented patterns of intimidation, failure to renew leases, and targeted rent increases that correlate specifically with the demographic makeup of the tenants. Meredith Langford rolled her eyes, her voice dripping with condescension. "Miss Hastings, do you have any hard evidence? Or are you relying on personal anecdotes and sensational claims?" Without missing a beat, Clara handed a bound set of documents to the court clerk. "We've gathered statements from over 20 residents, each detailing harassment from management. Additionally, these internal memos," she flipped a page, "suggest a deliberate plan to modernize the building by removing undesirable tenants. We'll see if that phrase is permissible in a modern housing market." A ripple of shock passed through the audience as Meredith's confident smile faltered. The phrase undesirable tenants carried sinister connotations, reminiscent of redlining and segregationist tactics from decades ago. Judge Albright flicked his gaze over the pages, then coughed. "Miss Hastings, the first C here references to notices that threatened legal action unless tenants vacated. If these notices are real, Westbridge Development has some explaining to do." He paused, glancing at Meredith. "Miss Langford, care to respond?" Meredith kept her composure, insisting the memos were taken out of context. But the damage was done. Clara's calm demeanor and razor-sharp presentation had pried open the door. Outside the courtroom, murmurs of admiration coursed through reporters. The rumor that an elderly civil rights icon was quietly re-emerging spread quickly. Yet Judge Albright remained stony-faced, refusing to acknowledge Clara's proficiency. Later that evening, Clara walked a dimly lit corridor alone. Her reflection in the polished marble walls showed not just an elderly woman, but the echoes of her younger self, a fiery advocate who once stood on the front lines with Thurgood, Marshall's proteges, and argued for equal opportunities in housing and employment. She remembered passing the bar exam after finishing her degree at Howard University School of Law, a real institution that had nurtured countless civil rights pioneers. Now, decades later, she was back in the fight. A swirl of memories rose unbidden. Back in 1978, she had sued a major landlord who refused to rent to Black families under the guise of property improvements. That case ended with a triumphant ruling declaring such practices illegal under the Fair Housing Act. Clara's victory had set a powerful precedent at the time, but the struggle for justice, she knew, was never truly over. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her reverie. It was a call from an old friend, Doris Miller, another veteran of the civil rights legal battles. Clara answered, smiling at the familiar voice. Doris wasted no time. "Clara, I heard rumors you're in LA fighting Westbridge. Is that right?" "Yes," Clara replied, feeling a stirring of warmth. "I couldn't just sit back and watch them evict people under false pretenses." Doris's raspy laughter crackled over the line. "Well, you always did have a knack for knocking down bullies. How's the judge?" Clara's pause spoke volumes. "He's difficult, condescending, reminds me of judges from a different era. But that's all right. I've dealt with worse." They talked for a few more minutes, reminiscing about old battles. When Clara hung up, her heart felt lighter, buoyed by memories of victories that seemed insurmountable at first. Perhaps Judge Albright's scorn was nothing but one more mountain to climb. Tomorrow, the next evidentiary hearing awaited, and she intended to climb that mountain armed with facts, law, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Morning traffic snarled the streets leading to the courthouse, but inside courtroom 12A, things moved swiftly. The day's agenda involved a crucial evidentiary hearing on whether key documents, those memos referencing undesirable tenants, would be admitted or deemed inadmissible due to procedural technicalities. Westbridge Development's team fought vigorously to exclude them, arguing that the documents had been obtained unlawfully by disgruntled former employees. Judge Albright, his spectacles perched at the tip of his nose, scanned the room. "Let's begin. Miss Langford, you contend that the memos were taken without proper authorization." Meredith Langford stood, posture immaculate. "That is correct, Your Honor. They were acquired through questionable means, thus violating the rules of discovery. We move to have them stricken from the record." Clara Hastings cleared her throat. "Your Honor, the manner in which these documents surfaced does not necessarily negate their authenticity. We can provide testimony from the employees who had rightful access. Furthermore, if Westbridge Development is concerned about privacy, they should explain why such overtly discriminatory language appears in corporate memos at all." Judge Albright tapped his pen, eyes narrowing at Clara. "Miss Hastings, even if these are authentic, there's still a question of admissibility." Clara's voice softened, but never wavered. "We have a sworn statement from those employees, along with metadata verifying these documents originated from Westbridge's official servers. We must consider the public interest in addressing potential civil rights violations over technical disputes." A moment of tense silence gripped the room. Finally, Judge Albright sighed. "I will allow a brief evidentiary inquiry. Let's call one of these employees to the stand." The door swung open, revealing a middle-aged man named Miguel Soriano. Once the head of Westbridge's local property management division, he had resigned after witnessing the unethical eviction practices. Under Clara's questioning, Miguel recounted staff meetings where executives allegedly discussed the clearing out of older and low-income residents to make room for higher-paying tenants. The hush in the courtroom was absolute as he described seeing emails with the words, "Make them uncomfortable until they leave." Judge Albright's expression shifted subtly, no longer just annoyance, but something akin to guarded concern. Perhaps, for the first time, he realized there was more to Clara Hastings than met the eye, and there was far more weight behind this case than corporate spin. By midday, local news channels had caught wind of the dramatic testimony. KTLA-5 dispatched reporters to cover the unfolding case in depth. Cameras lined the corridor outside courtroom 12A, capturing sound bites from tenants who felt they were the target of subtle but insidious gentrification. Whispers that Miss Hastings was the same attorney who had defeated racially restrictive housing practices in the 1970s began to circulate among journalists. Curiosity soared. During the lunch recess, Clara and Brian stood side by side at a small table in the courthouse cafeteria, poring over depositions. Their conversation was hushed, as if conspiratorial. Brian wiped beads of sweat from his brow. "We're up against a giant, Miss Hastings. They've got resources and connections. Their lawyers might try to drag this out until the plaintiffs run out of money or hope." Clara's eyes shone with quiet resolve. "That's the classic strategy, Brian. But times have changed since the 70s. Public opinion matters more. If we keep shedding light on what Westbridge is doing, we'll force their hand." A reporter cautiously approached them, microphone in hand. "Miss Hastings, rumor has it you once argued before the Supreme Court on a housing discrimination case. Is that true?" The question bristled with excitement. Clara offered a polite smile. "I contributed research and briefs to a case that eventually made its way to the Supreme Court, yes. That was a lifetime ago. My focus right now is on this case and these tenants." Moments later, Judge Albright wandered into the cafeteria for a quick bite and noticed the small crowd around Clara. His jaw tightened. He disliked media circuses. More than that, he despised feeling out of control. With each passing moment, it became clearer that this so-called little old lady commanded more influence and reverence than he had initially assumed. As the lunch break ended and everyone returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere crackled with expectation. Cameras waited outside, poised to catch every twist. The judge, well aware he was under scrutiny, stiffened in his seat, determined to maintain the upper hand. Yet, behind his stern facade, uncertainty lurked. Clara Hastings was proving to be no ordinary adversary. After the afternoon session, Judge Albright summoned both legal teams to his chambers. The cramped space behind the courtroom was lined with legal tomes, Black's Law Dictionary, and volumes of the Federal Reporter stacked haphazardly on the shelves. The judge's clerk offered them seats around a large wooden table. Clearing his throat, Judge Albright addressed Clara first. "Miss Hastings, your presence has stirred quite the commotion." His voice carried a touch of resentment. "I must ensure that personal publicity doesn't overshadow the law." Clara met his gaze calmly. "I agree, Your Honor. The law should be at the center of this. However, these evictions aren't just a legal matter. They have far-reaching social implications." Meredith Langford crossed her arms, stepping into the silence. "Your Honor, we believe Miss Hastings' approach is turning this into a media spectacle. We're concerned about prejudicing potential jurors." Judge Albright tapped his pen against the table. "Miss Hastings, I'm cautioning you, no grandstanding. Keep the focus on the case." The older woman offered a polite nod. "Certainly, Your Honor, but I'd ask that Westbridge's counsel do the same, especially given their access to influential networks that can shape public perception with or without cameras." That remark stung, prompting Meredith to visibly bristle. The judge, for a moment, seemed at a loss. He shifted uncomfortably, flipping through his docket. "Tomorrow, I'm scheduling an evidentiary ruling on these so-called internal memos. If they are admitted, we'll proceed with depositions from the plaintiffs. If they're excluded, Miss Hastings, you'll need a different strategy." Clara breathed evenly. "Understood, Your Honor." As the attorneys stood to leave, Judge Albright held Clara back with a raised hand. "A word," he said curtly, waiting until the others filed out. Then, once alone, he regarded her with an inscrutable expression. "I've heard stories about you cases you argued decades ago. People say you're a legend." Clara eyed him, unsure of his intent. "I'm just an attorney trying to do what's right." The judge sighed, half in frustration. "Yes, well, let's see if the law is on your side this time." In that moment, she sensed a flicker of curiosity in him. Maybe he realized there was more depth to her than he'd initially assumed. But old biases can die hard, and for Judge Albright, grappling with his own prejudice would be a battle all its own. That evening, Clara returned to her modest rental apartment, located a short train ride away from downtown. With a cup of chamomile tea in hand, she sank into a worn armchair, reflecting on the day's confrontations. No matter how many court battles she had endured, each new one tested her resolve anew. Her phone chimed with a text from Brian. Local pastors and community leaders want to meet. They're organizing tenants. "You in?" Smiling, she typed a brief affirmative reply. An hour later, she stepped into a small church basement off Crenshaw Boulevard. The air smelled faintly of pine disinfectant. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, a modest podium at the front. A group of tenants, some elderly, some single parents, and others simply concerned neighbors, gathered in tense clusters. The fear in the room was palpable fear of losing their homes, their community, their way of life. Reverend Jacobs, a stout man with a warm face, greeted Clara with a firm handshake. "We're glad you're here, Miss Hastings. We've heard about your past victories, and we pray you can help us now." She smiled and took the microphone. "We have a solid case, but it won't be easy. Westbridge is powerful. They'll try every trick to wear us down. But I assure you, if we stand united, residents, community leaders, and legal counsel, we can push back. A hush fell as people listened intently. A grandmother spoke up, voice quivering. "I've lived in my apartment for 27 years. They tried to evict me on claims I violated the lease by having my grandchildren visit too often. It's outrageous." Others chimed in with their own harrowing stories. With each account, Clara felt a renewed sense of urgency. This wasn't just another case. These were human lives, and the same sort of injustice she had fought against her entire career. By the end of the meeting, the once fractured tenants had a renewed spark of hope. They saw in Clara Hastings a beacon of resilience. And for Clara, the gathering affirmed why she had come out of retirement. This was her life's calling, to stand beside the vulnerable and challenge those who abuse their power. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of courtroom 12A as Judge Albright took the bench the next morning. The air bristled with anticipation. Journalists, community members, and legal observers packed the wooden pews, all eager to witness how the judge would rule on the admissibility of Westbridge's undesirable tenants' memos. "Court is now in session," the bailiff intoned, bringing the room to order. Judge Albright cleared his throat. "Having reviewed the submissions from both sides, I find that the authenticity of these documents is sufficiently supported by multiple credible sources, including sworn affidavits from former employees." Meredith Langford's face fell. She adjusted her glasses, her knuckles whitening around a pen. Judge Albright continued, "Therefore, I'm admitting them into evidence for the limited purpose of establishing corporate intent." He fixed a sharp glance at both counsel tables. "We're not here to try the case in the media. We will proceed with depositions and further evidentiary presentation. Understood?" A whispered wave of excitement rippled through the plaintiff's supporters. Brian Moore cast a relieved glance at Clara, who gave a slight nod. This was a critical victory, one that significantly bolstered the tenants' claims of systematic discrimination. Meredith stood, fighting to maintain composure. "Your Honor, we respect the court's decision, but we reserve the right to challenge the interpretation of these memos during trial." Judge Albright offered a curt nod. "Duly noted. Now, let's proceed." With that ruling, the case's momentum shifted. Witnesses came forward, each detailing intimidation and blatant attempts to make them vacate their apartments. While some grew emotional recounting their experiences, Clara gently guided them through cross-examination, ensuring their truth came out coherently and powerfully. All the while, Judge Albright kept a stern face, occasionally shooting a skeptical glance at Clara. Yet there was a discernible softening in his demeanor. As witness after witness corroborated the pattern of eviction abuse, he seemed forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. Perhaps the corporate attorneys were not the shining paragons of professionalism he had assumed. Maybe, just maybe, the elderly black woman in front of him was the real force of reason and justice in that courtroom. That afternoon, a chance encounter in a courthouse elevator peeled back another layer of Judge Albright's rigid facade. Clara was returning from a brief lunch break when she stepped into the elevator, only to find Judge Albright already inside. She nodded politely. He returned a curt greeting, clearing his throat as the doors slid shut. For several floors, they stood in silence, the mechanical hum filling the awkward void. Finally, the judge spoke, his gaze fixed on the numbers above. "You know, my father was a landlord in the 1960s, he began, voice low. He owned several buildings in a mixed neighborhood. I saw firsthand how different the treatment could be for black tenants versus white tenants. My father told me it was just business. That's how it was." Clara remained silent, waiting to see where he would take this. He sighed, an uncharacteristic heaviness in his tone. "I was a child, and I didn't understand. By the time I went to law school, things had started changing. Part of me believed the system had improved enough that such cases wouldn't happen anymore." She studied him, noticing the faint lines of regret etched around his eyes. And now, seeing this evidence must be difficult. He finally shifted his gaze to her. "It is," he admitted, almost a whisper, "but the law is the law. I won't allow personal biases to cloud my judgment." The elevator dinged, and the doors opened onto the floor where the hearing would resume. Clara gave a small nod before stepping out. "I appreciate your willingness to hear the facts, Your Honor." She walked away, heart beating faster than she expected. That brief conversation revealed a crack in his armor. Perhaps Albright's hostility stemmed from grappling with conflicting loyalties, his respect for the law, his childhood memories, and the uneasy realization that discrimination was still alive and well. Though the judge would never admit it openly, he was wrestling with ghosts from his past. And Clara, through her unwavering commitment, was forcing him to face them. The next morning, tension erupted outside the courtroom in a confrontation that showcased just how high the stakes had become. Meredith Langford, flanked by her associate attorneys, spotted Clara and Brian in the corridor reviewing their notes. With a cool arrogance, she approached, heels tapping crisply on the polished floor. "Miss Hastings," she said, voice bristling with false civility, "I see your reputation precedes you. But let's be clear about something. Westbridge Development is within its rights to improve its properties. If that means some long-term tenants can't afford the new amenities, that's unfortunate, but it isn't illegal." Clara placed a hand on her briefcase. "It becomes illegal when it's a targeted strategy to remove low-income and black tenants." Meredith gave an incredulous laugh. "Do you have any idea how ridiculous that sounds? We're a legitimate business, not a charity. Our aim is profit, not social engineering." Brian bristled, but Clara raised a calming hand, stopping him from responding out of anger. Instead, she addressed Meredith evenly. "Profit isn't a license to violate civil rights. We have more witnesses, more documents. If you'd like to settle this case quietly, I suggest you consider negotiation rather than continuing these displacements." Meredith's mouth tightened into a thin line. "We don't settle with fearmongers. We'll bury your little band of crusaders under paperwork until they give up. Your plaintiffs have limited funds, Miss Hastings. How long can you keep this up?" Silence stretched. A few bystanders watched anxiously, anticipating an outburst. But Clara simply gave a tight, determined smile. "As long as it takes." Turning on her heel, Meredith marched away, her legal team in tow. Brian exhaled loudly. "She's right about one thing," he said, voice laced with concern. "We don't have Westbridge's resources. The plaintiffs are already struggling with the cost of depositions and expert witnesses." Clara patted his shoulder. "We'll find a way," she replied softly. "If justice were easy, everyone would have it by now." In that hallway confrontation, lines were starkly drawn. Westbridge Development intended to play hardball, leveraging its financial might. Yet, for Clara Hastings, the fight had never been about money. It was about principle. And, in battles of principle, she had a long history of finding ways to prevail. Late in the afternoon, courtroom 12A was cleared for a key deposition, an executive from Westbridge Development named Randall Pierce. Tall and impeccably dressed, Randall exuded corporate confidence as he took his seat. A court reporter positioned herself, ready to transcribe every word. Judge Albright presided over the session informally, ensuring procedures were followed. Clara stood, adjusting her glasses. "Mr. Pierce, you've been with Westbridge for how long?" He cleared his throat. 7 years, ma'am." "During that time, have you been involved in tenant relations?" He hesitated. "Somewhat, but mostly at a high level. Strategic decisions." Clara nodded. "I understand. Could you explain the rationale behind the recent wave of eviction notices in the Lakeview Towers complex?" Randall attempted a businesslike smile. "We aim to modernize and upgrade the property, Miss Hastings. The evictions are unfortunate but necessary when tenants fail to meet new lease terms or maintain their units properly." Clara tapped a stack of documents on the table. "Isn't it true that your company singled out tenants over the age of 60, repeatedly requesting extensive renovations that far exceeded standard maintenance requirements?" Randall's face tensed. "We asked them to bring their apartments up to code. If they couldn't comply, that's their issue, not ours." Judge Albright observed quietly, but his gaze flickered with concern at Randall's phrasing. Clara flipped open another file. "We have memos already admitted into evidence where Westbridge officials refer to older tenants as uneconomic occupiers. Could you clarify what that means?" The question hung in the air like a drawn sword. Randall's composure slipped. "I'm not familiar with those exact documents," Clara pressed. "So you're not aware of any internal language indicating a plan to remove older residents specifically because they aren't as profitable?" Beads of sweat formed on Randall's brow. "I'd need to review the documents to confirm context, but we never intended to discriminate," he managed weakly. Clara's tone remained calm, almost compassionate. "Thank you, Mr. Pierce. No further questions at this time." The moment she sat down, the tension in the room broke like a released breath. Randall had not outright admitted wrongdoing, but his stumbling denials only reinforced the credibility of the plaintiff's claims. Judge Albright scribbled notes, clearly troubled by the executive's evasive answers. Clara, meanwhile, exchanged a small, triumphant nod with Brian. They knew this deposition could tip the scales decisively in their favor. That evening, Judge Albright found himself alone in his chambers, the hum of fluorescent lights and the muted chatter of departing staff filtering through the door. Before him lay a thick folder labeled Martinez et al. Versus Westbridge Dev. He tapped his pen restlessly on the desk, replaying the day's deposition in his mind. He couldn't ignore the mountain of evidence pointing to Westbridge's calculated campaign to drive out a specific demographic of tenants older, primarily African American, and with limited financial means. Randall Pierce's testimony weighed on him. Though Pierce never made a direct confession, his answers were riddled with telltale half-truths and an unmistakable undercurrent of guilt. Leaning back in his chair, Albright glanced at a framed portrait of his late father perched on a bookshelf. His father had died believing that business always trumped social responsibility. Now, as a judge, Albright was confronted with the ugly extension of that ideology. The lines between profit and prejudice were not as neatly drawn as his father once claimed. He recalled Clara Hastings, steadfast in her questioning, and how she championed the tenant's cause with a determination that transcended her age. Perhaps he had underestimated her, even belittled her, because deep down he feared confronting the fact that discriminatory housing practices were still rampant, even in a supposed post-racial era. He had wanted to believe that progress was absolute, that the law had evolved to shield everyone equally. But the truth was messy, and it demanded a judge who was willing to look squarely at the evidence rather than cling to comforting illusions. In a moment of introspection, Judge Albright closed the case file, exhaling a weary sigh. He was bound to follow the facts, not his biases. Whether it upended his preconceived notions or not, justice required that he recognize wrongdoing. He whispered to the silent room, "Maybe I was wrong about you, Miss Hastings." For the first time, he allowed himself to entertain the possibility that this elderly black woman, with her storied past, might be exactly the kind of advocate the law needed and exactly the kind of force to test his commitment to impartial justice. Just when the plaintiff seemed to have the upper hand, Westbridge Development rolled out a new strategy. Early the next morning, Brian Moore called Clara in a panic. They've just filed a motion to disqualify you from representing the tenants, he blurted the moment she picked up. They claim you have a conflict of interest, something about your past involvement in a city zoning board decades ago. Clara's heart pounded. She recalled that years ago she had served briefly on a local committee investigating fair housing allocations. Could Westbridge's legal team be twisting that into grounds for disqualification? She frowned. "Let's meet at my office," she said, her voice steady. "We'll figure this out." An hour later, they sat in a quiet conference room at a small legal aid building. Brian slid the motion papers across the table. The motion argued that Clara's past role on a city committee made her privy to confidential housing plans that might create bias or undue influence in the current case. Clara shook her head as she read, lips thinning with frustration. "They're reaching," she muttered. "I served on a volunteer oversight committee that looked at general housing trends. There was nothing specifically linked to Westbridge's property or the tenants. They're desperate." Brian clenched his fists. Desperate or not, it could delay the proceedings for weeks. They're trying to stall until the tenants run out of time and resources. Clara inhaled slowly. "This is an old tactic. We'll file a response stating there's no direct conflict. Judge Albright will see it for what it is, an attempt to muzzle us." That same afternoon, the court held an emergency hearing to address the motion to disqualify Clara. Judge Albright listened to Westbridge's arguments with a skeptical air. Clara then presented her counterargument, pointing out that the zoning board had only general data, open to the public at the time. After hearing both sides, the judge rolled his eyes, his patience clearly tested. "Motion to disqualify is denied," he said in a clipped tone. "We have more pressing matters to handle than these frivolous detours." Outside the courtroom, relief washed over Clara and Brian. The older attorney smiled wryly. "They're throwing everything at us. But if they think that's enough to rattle me, they clearly haven't studied my history closely." And so, Westbridge's ploy failed, revealing more of their desperation. The case pressed on, with Clara more determined than ever to expose the corporate giant's underhanded maneuvers. With each passing day, the evidence against Westbridge Development grew harder to dismiss. Multiple tenants testified that they received eviction notices immediately after complaining about maintenance issues, overcharged utilities, ignored repairs, and inaccessible facilities for the elderly. Internal emails introduced in open court mentioned turning up the heat on tenants who dared to seek legal recourse. Then came the revelation that sealed Westbridge's fate. A disgruntled junior associate from Meredith Langford's own legal team leaked a series of confidential memos suggesting that Westbridge knew their actions walked the razor's edge of legality. One particularly damning line read, "If older tenants can't handle the stress, they'll leave voluntarily. We'll avoid lawsuits by cycling them out one by one." As news of this leak hit the local channels, public outrage soared. Protesters gathered outside Westbridge's corporate headquarters, chanting for fair housing and carrying signs that read, "Profit over people is a crime." A black eye for the company's reputation, indeed. Judge Albright summoned both sides for an immediate conference. In an unexpected twist, Westbridge's CEO appeared in court to offer a settlement. The tension in the air was palpable as he announced plans to halt all pending evictions, pay damages to displaced tenants, and even provide a fund for future improvements. Meredith Langford, flustered, tried to salvage her position. "We believe this resolution is in the best interest of all parties," she said, forcing a professional veneer. In truth, the corporate giant was cornered. Clara Hastings, standing beside Brian Moore, listened carefully. She glanced at the cluster of tenants seated in the audience, many of them now wearing cautious expressions of hope. "We'll review your settlement offer," Clara said, her voice measured. But we also want clear, enforceable protections to prevent future violations. And that includes an independent oversight committee to monitor compliance. Judge Albright nodded gravely. That sounds reasonable. Westbridge, are you agreeable? The CEO, visibly uncomfortable, mumbled a grudging acceptance. Hard karma had indeed come calling. Westbridge's arrogance collided with the unyielding pursuit of justice, and the face of that justice was an elderly black woman who refused to be silenced. In the weeks that followed, the once combative case evolved into a structured settlement that went far beyond monetary compensation. Westbridge Development agreed to extensive reforms, a freeze on rent hikes for existing elderly tenants, a commitment to ADA-compliant upgrades, and the establishment of a tenant advisory board with real power to influence management decisions. The final settlement terms were hailed by community advocates as a groundbreaking step toward equitable housing practices in Los Angeles. Reporters scrambled to interview Clara Hastings, now openly recognized as the revered civil rights attorney she had always been. Although she graciously declined many requests, a few high-profile news outlets, such as the Los Angeles Times, managed to sit down with her. In one interview, she reflected on her decades-long fight for justice. "History doesn't stay in the past," she told the reporter. "It moves with us, shapes our laws, and tests our humanity. We see old battles arise in new forms. We must remain vigilant." On the day the settlement was formally approved in courtroom 12A, tenants applauded Clara and Brian as they exited the building. Some offered tearful hugs, others held signs of gratitude. The corridor echoed with the sounds of relief and celebration. Brian, eyes shining, turned to Clara. "Thank you for letting me learn from you. This experience, it's changed my perspective on the law entirely." She patted his shoulder. "I needed your fresh perspective too, Brian. Working together, we reminded the world that justice can be a collective effort." Then, to everyone's surprise, Judge Albright himself approached. There was a brief, awkward pause before he spoke. "Hastings, I'd like to offer an apology for my initial dismissiveness. I misjudged you. Your work here was exemplary, one of the best presentations of civil law I've witnessed." Clara's eyes held a warm acceptance. "Thank you, Your Honor. I appreciate your willingness to hear the facts." He extended his hand, and she shook it. In that moment, the victory was not just about winning a lawsuit, it was about bridging divides between generations, between perceptions of power, and between a judge confronting his own biases and an attorney forging a legacy of justice. 2 weeks after the final settlement was signed, a small celebration took place in the same church basement where Clara had first met the frightened tenants. This time, the mood was decidedly different, joyful, almost festive. Tables were laden with potluck dishes, homemade cornbread, collard greens, tamales, and fruit salads, reflecting the cultural mosaic of the neighborhood. Clara arrived in a modest navy dress, walking with a steadier gait than before. The weight of the case lifted, she allowed herself a rare moment of relaxation. Brian stood by her side, introducing her to residents. "Miss Hastings, meet Miss S. Rivera. She's lived here for 30 years and was on the brink of eviction." Miss S. Rivera, eyes moist with gratitude, hugged Clara. "Thank you for fighting for us. Now I can stay in my home, watch my grandchildren grow up in the same community." Similar sentiments echoed throughout the room, from seniors who no longer feared arbitrary evictions to younger families who felt a renewed hope in the justice system. Among the crowd, a recognizable figure emerged: Judge Albright, albeit without his black robe, wearing a simple grey suit and looking somewhat out of place. Whispers coursed through the gathering, but a respectful hush fell as he approached Clara. "Miss Hastings," he said quietly, I wanted to stop by and congratulate the tenants. It seems your community is quite remarkable. Clara smiled gently. I'm glad you came, Judge. Your ruling ensured this settlement was fair and meaningful. That's a victory for all of us. He nodded, scanning the room filled with laughter and relief. I've spent years on the bench, and rarely have I seen such a clear demonstration of law intersecting with moral responsibility. They spoke briefly about her past cases, about the times she had faced worse discrimination inside the courtroom. It's been a long road, Clara admitted, but every fight for justice makes the next one a little more possible. As the evening wore on, the church hall filled with music, conversation, and a poignant sense of unity. No longer was Clara Hastings just an elderly black woman overshadowed by a skeptical judge. She was the living embodiment of a legendary attorney who had once again shaped the course of people's lives, reminding everyone that justice, with enough perseverance, can still prevail. News of the settlement reverberated across California. Housing advocacy groups hailed it as a model for communities confronting displacement and gentrification. City officials began drafting new ordinances to strengthen tenant protections, citing the Westbridge case as a wake-up call. In Sacramento, a group of state legislators invited Clara to speak at a public hearing on housing reforms. Despite her aversion to the spotlight, she recognized the importance of this moment. Dressed in a crisp black suit, she took the podium before a panel of lawmakers, recounting the hardships faced by the tenants and how a single corporate policy could uproot entire communities. The law must protect the marginalized, she stated, voice unwavering. It's not enough to have statutes on paper. We need enforcement, accountability, and moral conviction. Her testimony left an indelible mark on the proceedings. By the time she stepped down, multiple legislators vowed to propose stricter regulations against discriminatory rental practices. The hearing underscored how one localized case could spark broader change. Outside the legislative chamber, a young political activist approached Clara with tears in her eyes. Hastings, I grew up hearing stories about your legal victories from my grandmother. She said you helped people believe in the system again when it failed them. Thank you for doing that once more. The elderly attorney felt a pang of emotion. Each new generation, she realized, inherited the same struggle: equity versus exploitation. If her efforts gave them even a small advantage, then she had done her part. As Clara made her way down the grand steps of the state capitol, her phone buzzed. It was a voicemail from a publishing house expressing interest in her life story. She couldn't help but chuckle at the irony. A quiet warrior for justice, reluctant to be in the limelight, was now sought after by the public. Perhaps she would consider it not for self-glorification, but to inspire future advocates who might carry the torch forward. After all, every story of triumph over adversity has the potential to kindle the fire of change in someone else. On a crisp Saturday morning, Clara Hastings found herself back in the neighborhood that had become the heart of the Westbridge case. She strolled through the revitalized courtyard of Lakeview Towers, noting the new accessibility ramps and freshly painted walls. Laughter drifted from a nearby playground where children chased each other, their parents and grandparents looking on with relief instead of worry. She smiled at how much could change in just a few months. The building manager, once perceived as an enforcer of corporate greed, had been replaced by someone more community-oriented. "Good morning, Miss Hastings," the new manager called, offering her a cup of coffee from a makeshift stand in the courtyard. "Thank you for everything." Clara accepted the coffee, savoring its warmth as she chatted with a few tenants. They mentioned no more threats, no more abrupt eviction notices. Instead, they spoke of a renewed sense of security, of planning for the future rather than bracing for displacement. In a quiet corner of the courtyard, she ran into Judge Albright again, out of his usual setting. Dressed in casual clothes, he appeared to be meeting with a local committee about a community outreach initiative. He greeted Clara with a respectful smile. "Quite the transformation, isn't it?" She nodded, gazing at the repainted building. "Yes, and it's not just the facade, it's the atmosphere. There's hope here." He took a slow breath. "This whole situation has made me re-evaluate some of my assumptions about the role of the judiciary. We're not just referees, we're guardians of society's values." The sincerity in his voice moved her. For a moment, they stood in companionable silence, two individuals from different backgrounds who had converged on a crucial cause. "Thank you for listening to the evidence," Clara said quietly. He nodded. "Thank you for presenting it so clearly, and for reminding me that justice is more than just a word in a law book." They parted ways, each carrying a renewed sense of purpose. Clara had come to realize that her legendary status wasn't merely about past achievements. It was about an ongoing commitment to do what she did best, stand up for those who can't always stand up for themselves. Some months later, Brian Moore passed the California bar exam with flying colors, propelled by the inspiration and mentorship he'd received from Clara Hastings. On the day he was sworn in, Clara sat in the audience of a packed ceremony at the Stanley Mosque Courthouse, her face glowing with pride. Surrounding her were newly minted lawyers from various backgrounds, each ready to embark on their journey in the legal field. Once the formalities concluded, Brian found Clara in the crowd and embraced her. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said, eyes welling with emotion. "You showed me what being a lawyer truly means." Clara squeezed his hand. "You earned this, Brian. And now it's your turn to be the advocate people deserve." He nodded, brimming with enthusiasm. "I plan to start my own practice, focusing on tenant rights. Already got a few potential clients lined up. Maybe we can collaborate." Her expression softened. "I'd like that very much. Keep me updated on your progress." In that moment, she felt a sense of closure. The circle was complete. A new generation of determined, compassionate attorneys was stepping forward. And if they carried just a fraction of the unyielding spirit she'd poured into her cases, the fight for justice would continue unabated. As the crowd dispersed, a young black woman approached Clara, her law degree still fresh in its folder. "Hastings, I'm heading to Howard University School of Law next year for my LLM, she said, starry-eyed. "I studied your 1970s cases on housing discrimination in my undergrad class. It inspired me to pursue civil rights law." Clara gently placed a hand on the young woman's shoulder. "I wish you all the best. The road's not easy, but it's worth every challenge. Remember, the law is a powerful tool when wielded with integrity. It can change lives." Walking away, Clara felt a peaceful certainty in her heart. The flame of justice had been passed on. The seeds she planted decades ago were sprouting in ways she could never have imagined. And somewhere, perhaps in a courthouse or a city hall meeting, another ignorant voice might mock an older woman or a minority attorney, only to be astounded by the power and legacy that stood before them. And that, dear viewers, is the incredible journey of Clara Hastings, an elderly black woman, many dismissed at first glance, only to realize she was a legendary attorney whose storied career reshaped the very foundations of housing rights. From tense courtroom showdowns to inspiring a new generation of lawyers, her steadfast determination revealed that true justice transcends age, race, and the barriers of prejudice. If you found this story uplifting and thought-provoking, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us bring more powerful narratives to life, stories of resilience, courage, and transformation that can spark real change in our communities. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more tales that celebrate the enduring fight for justice and the triumph of the human spirit.